it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Whiskey in the jar. Stand and deliver. Padraig uttered the words he'd heard so often in tales. He was only now learning the highwayman's art, though he'd often practiced in his daydreams and in private moments, away from spying eyes. The dour-looking soldier, a sergeant by his insignia, who approached up the pass, looked down his nose in disgust tinged perhaps with amusement. Best you put away that old pistol and scamper back to your hut, boy. You're liable to be hurt if you persist in pointing weapons at the king's soldiers. I mean it. Best hand over that purse or I'll... You'll what, fool? The tall redcoat stepped forward and slapped the pistol from Padraig's hand, and before the young man could react, he'd drawn his own sabre and knocked aside that of the would-be robber. Padraig backed off a few paces, and then turned to flee, lest he be recognized. Well, that was unlikely. He'd taken great pains to cover his features in a large red bandana, and wore a large floppy hat that obscured his hair and eyes. It didn't matter. The soldier was in no mood to go traipsing through the brush after a silly boy playing at highwayman. "Ah, run, you mewling pup," he called after the reprobate. He paused to examine the decrepit pistol the young one had dropped. It was in fair enough condition. A bit rusty, but it might still work with some cleaning and brushing. He used the clip to hang it on his bandolier and continued his journey in a slightly less dour mood. Padraig had scampered a fair distance from the pass. He clung to his sabre after the tall man had struck it. He'd almost lost his grip. The man was strong as a boar and fast as an adder. He'd expected a bullet to the back all the time he'd run. He'd heard that's what British soldiers did with rebels and outlaws. Up until the moment he'd uttered his challenge, he'd been neither, and if he made his escape, he wouldn't have to be. His decent enough family had sent him to apprentice at the manor of a noble lord, but he'd grown bored, and the tales told among the local folk had inspired him to try his hand at adventuring. Well, he clearly failed. What old Fian had told him was true. He would need to train extensively before he took on any serious targets. Fian had been in some sort of militia at some time, or so he hinted. He was as close to an experienced fighter as Padraig knew. He was lost in dismal thoughts of his failure and, dare he even admit it to himself, his cowardice. His shame burned hot on his cheeks till the first cold, fat drops of rain struck them and chilled his entire form. He looked up at the lowering dark sky, slate-grey and heavy with rain. He then belatedly looked around for shelter. There was nothing appealing, just brush and a few rocks that wouldn't shelter a starving rabbit. He was too far away from the estate to make it home before he'd be drenched and chilled to the bone. Then he recalled the little shanty that had hidden in the next hollow. He'd imagined it as some romantic nest of robbers, but had steered clear in the end, on his way to set his trap at the trail. The place was abandoned, and had a spooky look to it, even in daylight. Now it was the only likely place to hole up until the storm passed. As he hurried over the hill, the drops increased in volume, and by the time he'd made it to the little structure, his outer clothing was wet and steaming. He was sure he would appear as some spectral form to anyone who saw him, and he smiled at that. My turn to do the frightening. Well, if there had ever been a door, it was gone. There was an overhang of thatch where he paused for a moment, just in case some wild creature had sought shelter here as well. It smelled musty, and there was a hint of an odour. About then, the torrent arrived, and he had to decide. So he plunged into the darkened interior. He paused when his shin struck some hard object, possibly a piece of furniture long abandoned. He crouched and felt around in front of him. It was a stool, so he set it straight and took a seat to await the adjustment of his vision to the near absence of light. A rumble sounded outside, from over the hills where the darkest clouds resided. He hadn't noticed the initial flash of lightning. He'd been occupied with setting up his perch. The next one was closer and lit the interior of the little shack momentarily. Well, not by much, but he could see where the hearth lay. There may also have been some wood and kindling. Fire would go right well and ease his rattled nerves. He looked toward the door as the next flash of lightning lit the landscape. Wait, was that a shape? A living thing that cast a shadow? He saw the shade, but not what had cast it. The crack of thunder sounded almost immediately after the flash and set him to trembling. The torrent became a deluge, and the water roared above him. He put all of his skills to work in building a fire on the small hearth at the center of the hut. In the flickering light, he saw that there was indeed a woodpile. It was substantial enough to get him through the night, if he was frugal and kept the fire small. All the while the lightning flashed and the thunder pounded away, vibrating his teeth with its force. He peered through the doorway and, once again, there was a shadow, closer now and more defined by the ripples of blue-white electrical charges. The head was elongated, and the ears rose above it and pointed forward. Somehow he knew it was towards him. It was only a silhouette, no substance to the outline, yet it loomed ever closer as the storm reached a crescendo. And then it was at the door, impossibly large, greater even than the wolfhound his master owned and that lounged about indoors, fed better than many of the human servants. The thing was blacker than the night, than the utter darkness that reigned in between blinding flashes when the eyes were stunned and vision flared. He slowly and, he hoped, silently hefted his saber, prepared to defend himself from this beast of the tempest. At the next chain of bolts from the heavens, it was gone. Gone from his sight, just as the briefly lit countryside beyond the threshold disappeared between each burst. He breathed a sigh of relief and turned back to the wee blaze that spread warmth and a merry light to contrast with the harsh illuminations of nature incarnate. He set down his blade, an old heavy thing, and placed another stick on the fire. Oh, maybe he'd stolen the shadow's lair. Maybe it was just a trick of the light and shadows. Maybe... He yelped. His teeth sank into his shoulder. He rolled onto his side and then onto his back and looked up into the twin fires of enormous eyes. They bored into his own and overwhelmed his consciousness, which had fled down a long, gloomy corridor to join the night and the crashing and burning air. Padraig awakened to a cool, damp and dreary morning. His fire had long since burned out, since he'd not been awake to feed it. Pain immediately lanced through his shoulder, and the nightmare image of the blazing eyes and the gaping jaws appeared for a flash, just like the lightning, but solely in his mind. He shuddered, bones crackling and scraping one another at the joints, and then rose, his entire body feeling racked and feverish. He was incredibly thirsty, and hunger gnawed at his belly. He searched the hovel and found nothing to eat or drink. Plenty of water had fallen the previous evening, so he was at least able to slake his thirst. He would truly have preferred a good ale or beer, but he had to take what he could get. He felt confused, and his head seemed to contain more sawdust than usual. He finally reasoned out that if he started at once, he might be able to get home by late afternoon. If he'd been missed, and likely he had been, well, he'd have to figure out an excuse. At the moment, he had no idea what to say when confronted with his absence. He wasn't a particularly efficient servant, and had failed to learn his duties or any significant refinements that a young man would need in order to move among the upper classes. He might be sacked and set on the road. If so, he would either have to hone his own survival and fighting skills, or find a robber band to join and learn from those experienced with nefarious behavior. He took a last look around the shanty and noted a bundle of rags in one corner. He hadn't moved them during his initial inspection, but now that he thought about it, they might conceal an object of value, should such a place ever have contained one. He poked at the bundle with a stick of the mostly undisturbed woodpile. There was a small hard object underneath the soft and tattered cloth. He set aside the stick and went to work with his hands. Wild thoughts of hidden treasure raced around the inside of his skull, over the sand that still seemed to fill his head. It was a simple jar. It was sealed and stamped with some sort of animal head, an elongated snout with ears that pointed forwards. Odd, he thought briefly, like something he'd dreamt. He broke the seal, and the scent of a rare perfume arose from the container. Whiskey. He chanced to taste. It was sublime. Before he knew what he was doing, he drained the little vessel. Well, now, that certainly satisfied. Almost as well as a large breakfast would have, and certainly took care of my thirst, he snorted as he stuffed the jar into his side bag. It was past time to go, and so he set out for the manor. Long, skinny legs applied at a pace that would eat up the miles. The stiffness in his joints soon faded, and the pain in his shoulder subsided much sooner than he would have expected. He soon found himself loping along, comfortably at what any soldier would recognize as a dog trot. He breathed deeply of the damp air and took in the odors of the freshly washed landscape. He heard the birds sing and knew that it would not rain again immediately. The air didn't hold such promise. The steward was definitely unpleased when the bedraggled Padraig strolled into the estate by the back gate. The imperious Fleming was fastidious to an almost insane degree, and expected the rest of the staff to maintain the same standard. He was also determined to rid his lordship's staff of the shiftless young man who would rather daydream than perform the task necessary, and indeed vital, to the effective operation of the estate. Fleming was not a tall man, yet he managed to look down his nose at Padraig. Well, young McIntyre, I see that you've traipsed through a bog and a forest of nettles during your unapproved absence. It will go hard on you this time. Get yourself cleaned up and pack your things. You may meet me back here at the gate in half an hour. Do be prompt, I have other duties and wish to waste no more time on you. You've proven yourself to be unteachable. Padraig grinned down at the man, and moved up close so he could look down his nose in turn. As you like. I've had my fill of you and your henpecking. Constantly on about things that the noble lord doesn't even notice, much less appreciate. Or your talk about duty and attention to detail for their own sake. He snapped his fingers under the shorter man's nose. That's what I give for your details. I'll be back down all right, as soon as I like. I'll take a meal in the kitchens before I deign to meet with such as you. Best you have cook prepare me some meat before I set out on my travels. He paused, breathing heavily, almost panting. Oh, and ensure that the meat is fresh and not overcooked. Oh, Fleming was nonplussed. In the past, the young man had been indolent and careless in his duties, but he'd always grovelled when confronted with consequences. Fleming had intended to sack him and let him come back and abase himself in a few days' time. Then he'd give him a last chance. However, the boy had now been so insolent, even a little threatening. Fleming would not stand for the assault on his dignity. He made his decision. You shall leave now. You can stand outside the gate until I have your personal items placed in a bundle and delivered to you. You need never darken the threshold of this estate. That was as far as he got. Padraig stepped forward, which forced the smaller man to give ground. A low rumble issued from the young man's chest, and rose until it blew past his lips as a menacing growl. Indeed, the lips had parted and now stretched into a bestial snarl. Oh, this was something else new to Fleming's experiences. Something in the sound, in the appearance of the features, in the demeanor of the lean fellow with the ridiculous red bandana draped around his neck, which frightened him. He took another step backward in an unconscious attempt to create some distance and thus safety. Yet Padraig matched his steps until his back collided with the wall. There would be no further retreat. While Padraig was taller, it wasn't by all that much, until now. He seemed to tower above the steward in the shadow of the wall. His skinny frame now appeared lean and strong. Fleming felt that in a moment the boy would lunge in and tear out his throat with those teeth of his. They looked large and gleaming and perhaps a little longer. I'll have some hot water delivered to your quarters and some meat. Padraig smiled as the officious little man surrendered completely and scurried away into the manor to do his bidding. Perhaps he should bully the man into letting him stay. Yet he wanted nothing more than to return to the wild, to the bracken in the hills. He would, however, demand a stipend to go with his last week's wages. He decided that it was his due, and he would no longer take less than he was owed. He stalked into the servants' quarters and into the little cell he shared with another servant, Billy. Billy was not his friend. The young man had borrowed money from him more than once, and despite all promises, had failed to return it. He was not a large young man, but bigger and thicker through the body than Padraig, so he intimidated his now confident roommate for some time. Billy lay curled on his bed, face to the wall. He looked over his shoulder when Padraig entered the little space.
Best look out, Paddy. The old steward has it in for you.
Not that I care. I can finally have the room to myself. As punctuation, he expelled some gas in Padraig's general direction. The lean young man wrinkled his nose at the stench and rumbled in his newly found deep and menacing voice. I've told you, my name is either Padraig or McIntyre. I don't like being called Paddy. Billy snorted, rolled over and sat up.
Yeah, and who cares what you like?
He peered up at his erstwhile roommate and fellow footman.
Why don't you...
His words froze, stuck in his throat by the vice-like grip that had seized his windpipe. He gagged. He tried to cough, to breathe. He soon found himself on his feet and then on his toes. Padraig's visage assumed a snarl once again.
You'll do as I say, and you'll pay back all that you owe me.
You'll pay double to compensate me for your intended thievery. His eyes blazed and bored into those of the round-shouldered Billy. He maintained his grip until Billy's face darkened and his body started to go limp, and then contemptuously tossed him backward onto his bunk. Billy coughed and grasped and wheezed for several moments. He was loud, but Padraig heard the faint, polite scratch at the door and the low, sweet voice that accompanied it.
Molly,
he realized. He'd embarked on his adventures, at least in part, to impress the young maid. He opened the door, and she entered the chamber, head down over a steaming bowl of water, a towel slung neatly across one arm. Padraig stepped back to make room for her in the confined space. She set the large bowl on the tiny table and placed the towel between the edge of the bowl and the wall. She glanced up at Padraig, then took a second, longer look, as her mouth formed a little mew of surprise. She, unlike Padraig, was a diligent servant and quickly recovered her composure.
Fleming said to bring you this.
Her eyes wandered briefly to Billy's hacking and tear-stained face, and then back up to Padraig's eyes.
Is there anything else you might need?
She asked out of habit, rather than with any intention of doing more than she'd been assigned. Padraig grinned at her, a toothier grin than he'd possessed the last time he'd done so.
Thank you, sweet Molly. That'll be all for now.
Perhaps before I take my leave, we might have some words? Molly stared up at him. Well, she was fond enough of the young rake. He was handsome enough and had a sense of humor, but she'd matured past the point that such men gave her any pleasure. She preferred the steady types, like the constable, who managed the master's horseflesh. I don't think that'd be possible, Padraig. Well, I'm spoken for, and I don't know what you could say that, well, you know, you've lost your prospects. She trailed off weakly. Something in his demeanor had created a fear response in her. The chamber felt suddenly far too small, and he far too large for her comfort, perhaps even her safety. She backed out of the room and fled down the corridor. Padraig simply smiled in her wake. He watched the enticing curves of her backside as she stumbled hurriedly back toward the kitchen, almost running from him. He then turned back to Billy, who'd finally managed to sit up on the edge of his bunk once more.
I'll give you 1 week. When you get your next wages, you'll turn over the entire sum to me, along with the rest that you now owe.
Billy looked up in fear.
I won't have enough with just my wages.
Before he could blink, Padraig's face loomed up close to his and issued a growl.
Borrow it.
He stood and turned toward the basin of water.
And best you clear out for now. I'll see you in a week.
Billy did as he was bid. He paused only to pick up a fresh pair of trousers. The ones he was currently wearing were full. Padraig, his belly and purse more filled than they'd been since he'd first arrived at the manor, was sent from his home. He now loped energetically up into the wild hills above the rich valley. He felt no pangs at departing, and he was determined to embark on a new career. He discovered the confidence to once more try his hand at being a highwayman, so he set out at a mile-eating pace for a certain path along which a tall, dour sergeant might make his way back to his regiment. He wore a grin that his erstwhile companions would not quite recognize. It was in a mouth with a much wider gape, and the teeth were whiter and sharper than they had been. The face was shaggy and unkempt, like a man who hadn't shaved for a month, yet he'd done so only 2 days past and hadn't truly needed it. His beard had been hardly present the day before. He didn't care. He felt that it added to the menace he would now need to project. He found his old hiding place behind a large old tree. It had apparently enjoyed the storms. The leaves were brighter and looked full. Padraig took a good whiff of the air and traversed the area in an ever-widening circle. There was no trace of the soldier or any other traveller since the storm. No tracks and no scent. I didn't quite understand why he thought he'd be able to detect a thing such as that, yet it felt natural. His instincts had been correct, but the soldier had taken a leave to visit the city. The next afternoon, under a light grey sky, he walked up the trail, his expression less dour. Behind him trailed 4 poor wretches whom he had clearly recruited, and they were in turn followed by 2 uniformed soldiers. Padraig still had his rusty old sabre, and he picked up an axe from the yard of the estate as a parting gift from his former master. He quietly stepped out into the trail. The sergeant looked up, startled.
Here. You again. Oh, you are looking rough, boy. Where's your mask?
Padraig smiled his new and improved toothy grin, which pulled back his now slightly pointed ears.
Stand and deliver,
he growled in a now menacing tone. The sergeant barked, and as rapidly as he had last time drew his own blade. He was far slower than Padraig in this instance. He stood astounded as he watched his sword and the hand that gripped it fly off to his right. There was a bright fountain of scarlet from his wrist. He held it up before his eyes in astonishment. He didn't have long to be stunned, though. Padraig stepped up and seized the damaged limb. He raised it to his lips and took a long pull from the claret stream. The dour sergeant fainted dead away, as much from mental shock as physical. The 4 recruits stared for a moment, the sight before them unclear. They saw a flash of blades and watched the sergeant kneel before a man with a wild look and blood-covered face, before he slumped to the ground with an air of permanency. Each was just happy to pause for a moment from the dreadful pace that the tall man had set as they climbed into the hills. The 2 soldiers who'd lagged behind looked up, annoyed that their charges had stopped, and then they spied their fearless leader stretched upon the ground, Before they could react, a figure leapt down the trail and leaped upon them. A brass-clad fist struck Tom in the jaw, and he was soon stretched on the ground in imitation of his sergeant. Georgie wasn't far behind him. The pommel had blown out his lights. The recruits turned in a gaggle, astonishment in their hearts, and clear upon their faces. Padraig then turned toward them.
"Do you have something for me? No doubt you each took the king's shilling, willingly or no. Well, I'll have those from you, but nothing else. Then you're free to go, well, unless you'd rather rove the hills with me for a while."
The four men looked at one another, and then back at Padraig. None of them had had any prospects prior to being pressed into service. The truly destitute rarely did. 3 of them handed a coin each to the eldest and largest of their number. "Seamus," the man said simply, as though it was an introduction and explanation of his life, as he dug out his own coin and held out the money to Padraig.
"Padraig,"
the hirsute, whipcord robber replied in kind. He squatted over the 2 soldiers and rifled through their pouches and belongings. He presently stood and offered the muskets and shooting gear to Seamus and the second stoutest man. Since the men had not fled, he assumed that they had accepted his offer. He now had a band of doughty men to ply the roads and trails. They left the soldiers completely stripped, but Padraig filched his now clean pistol from the sergeant's bandolier, then hefted the man's body over his shoulder and loped off toward the next ridge. The 4 men followed. Seamus picked up Padraig's old saber from where he discarded it in favor of the sergeant's newer and better-made weapon. While the 4 men struggled to catch up to their new leader, even though he carried a heavy load. He knew his destination, and they did not. About the time they lost his trail and stopped and stared around hopelessly at the trackless wild, he appeared once more, now free of his burden. He gave them a grin in the lowering early evening light.
"Come on, my friends. Those men had a little food in their knapsacks and coins in their purses. I'll keep the 4 shillings from the king. You may divide the rest between you. It is considerably more. I have a little shanty in the brush beyond that rock pile." He pointed then to the barely visible roof, and the men headed that way without any argument. Padraig decided that, so far, he liked his new companions. He didn't care for the mindless chatter that too many people made. Until now, he'd been unable to stop it. Now, though, he felt that he could rip out the throats of all the chatterboxes in the world. The men took up residence in the shack and moved about the detritus on the floor and set a proper fire. None of them explored the rags in the corner. Padraig stepped inside for a moment, but he soon felt claustrophobic and stalked back outdoors. He sniffed around and circled the area to ensure that there were no more unexpected dangers. He saw and smelled no other canines or lupines. There was no sign of the large black beast that had attacked him. He now suspected that it had all been a nasty dream and he'd simply awakened with a sore neck. He wondered more at the effects of the elixir in the wee jar. He stopped in a little hollow and dined on the dour sergeant, who tasted so much sweeter than his features had once promised. "Light pork,"
Padraig realized as he munched flesh and gnawed bones. After he was sated, he resumed his patrol and discovered an old still out behind the shanty. Nearby that, he literally sniffed out a cachet of the potion. The little jar sat all in a row within a solid crate that rested inside a nice dry opening in the rocks, almost like a little shrine. Padraig grinned again and took out one of the containers. It felt full. He stripped off the stopper and took a whiff, then quickly downed the substance. He felt immediately fortified. He worked his way back to the little hut and lay up close by so that he could hear the men and their conversation. He soon found out that Seamus's companions were called Sean, Eamon, and Henry. They'd all been labourers, and work had recently been scarce. Seamus and Henry had relatively steady employment, but Sean and Eamon had been unable to find work many days, and times had been lean of late.
They'd greedily taken up the king's coin with hopes toward full bellies, or at least less empty than on most days for them. Seamus and Henry had been convinced more by a chance to do something longer term. Perhaps occasionally dangerous, but mostly steady and with a chance for travel. Appealing enough for young men, but this latest opportunity might be even better. The work would be even less steady, but there might be more treasures to be had, and a chance to travel, but in style. The more the young men spoke, the more appealing the life of a rover appeared, as each built up the idea. Padraig decided that he would let them live for the time being. Over the next few days, the pack of men made themselves a menace to travellers who took the small track over the hills. They didn't find tremendous treasures, but they found food and sundries to make their lives comfortable. As their first week together came to a close, Padraig, who was happiest roaming the countryside at night, gathered the men around the hearth. "I must travel tonight. I shall be back by morning, but if not, what I need to do won't take much longer." With that, he turned swiftly and disappeared from the lodging that was in need of expansion. Sean looked to his companions after their leader had melted into the encroaching darkness. "That one is strange. Definitely a dangerous type. I've never before seen his like." "Nor any of us," Henry added. "Has his hair grown during the past week?" Eamon stared into the fire. "He's taller, and his face looks stretched. His teeth are longer." Seamus remained quiet for a moment, and assisted Eamon in his search of wisdom in the flames. "We all know the stories of of what lurks in these hills. Nobody stays here after dark. They hurry through quickly to get either side of the pass. This place is eerie, no doubt, and not just because of our friend who roams the dark. The other night I was sure I heard strange calls, maybe howls off in the distance, and not far enough." He shivered then. "Still, we've done well enough. We'll have to move soon. Folks will stop traveling the trail altogether when they realize that the shortcut will lead to disaster. It's a shorter route, but the main road is safer." The men spoke long into the evening. They were young and accustomed to hard work. The recent days of leisure and taut bellies had led to some restlessness. Their conclusions were that the outlaw leader was very dangerous, and they wished to remain in his good graces, even if the adventure had already grown stale. Mostly they spoke of the helplessness they'd learned from those above their station. They understood that their position was precarious, but had no idea how to challenge Padraig, or even to ask to be released back to their own devices. They were sure that they could not return to their hometown. Too many fine citizens had seen them march off with the redcoats. It would take many more conversations for them to resolve to act, and many more before they decided to put their plans in motion. "Billy," Padraig barked in the ear of his former cellmate in the manor. It was loud to his target, but with the door closed, no one else would have heard. Billy heard and stirred accordingly. His eyes rolled and stared into the gloom that they could not penetrate. Padraig could see just fine. His eyesight had improved dramatically with every draught of the elixir he'd discovered. One draught every other day or so seemed enough to keep him improving himself. And as for Billy, he'd convinced himself during the week that he'd only imagined that Padraig could become dangerous. He didn't have the entire sum that the formerly scrawny fellow had demanded, but he had a truncheon he'd scrounged from the wood-bin, clutched in his hand just in case the fool showed. He felt the heat from the bulk that rested near the head of his cot. You couldn't see much, but there was a deeper shadow in the general outline of a hirsute man looking too close for comfort. A stout hand gripped his shoulder and shook him once. He didn't need or want further encouragement. I have your money, mostly. I couldn't get anyone to lend me more." He stopped when a deep, rumbling growl emerged from the obscure, hulking figure that exuded even more menace than it had done only a few days past. He forgot his truncheon. Something told him that it would be a fruitless and possibly fatal gesture to strike the beastly man who now crouched in his chamber. He felt himself lifted by the grip on his shoulder, and another iron grip closed on his other shoulder as he was lifted bodily from the bed. He kept rising for a moment, and then felt himself plunge until his supine body struck the floor. His head cracked against the floor, but the primary impact had been across his shoulders. He lay stunned, unable to move his arms and to do no more than twitch his legs. Padraig's voice rasped deeply. "What did you think you were going to do with your little stick? Did you have some idea of failing to pay the debt you owe?" He didn't wait for an answer. He knew that Billy still lacked the oxygen to do more than cough and wheeze in an attempt to refill his lungs. "Now, unless you have something else of value, I'll have to take it out in flesh or blood." His hand searched the body of the stunned man on the floor. He found the wee bag that Billy kept strung around his neck. He'd already filched his belt pouch that held all his coins. He'd noted the little bag during their time living in the same space. He'd been too intimidated to ask about it, and Billy appeared to want to keep it hidden, so he had left it alone. But now he snatched it and broke the leather thong, careless of the pain and burn it must have caused to Billy's already abused neck. He could see the expression on Billy's face, grown alarmed. The bag clearly contained something of value that he feared to lose. The round, flushed face worked to protest, but sufficient air had yet to circulate to allow him to speak above a low whisper. "Please, not that. It's all I have of my family. I'll pay you double, just please. Let me keep it." Padraig bared his now substantial fangs. "Triple the original sum, and I'll be back in 10 days. He stuffed the wee bag into his waistcoat pockets. He now had to leave the garment unbuttoned since his chest and shoulders had expanded. "Come through with it, or I'll shove this," he held up the truncheon, "someplace you don't want it." He then barked out a short laugh. Billy could only shake his head as his eyes filled with tears. The door opened and Padraig was silhouetted briefly against a light that leaked down the corridor. Billy shuddered at the large, hair-covered beast-man that exited the chamber and crept toward the kitchens. Padraig removed a pair of hams from the larder on his way out of the house. He now cared mostly for Long Pig, but these would likely make his pack happy. He made it back to the shanty before dawn and placed the food beside the hearth. He examined the 4 sleeping men. They were a sorry lot, and he'd have to find some way to improve them if they were to become a terrifying crew of cutthroats who would frighten travelers into quick surrender. He wished to continue to take lives, but the fewer the better. Travelers would tell tales. He wanted them told of how ferocious he and his band were, and how much better it was to surrender to their demands and preserve one's life for future travels. He could always find meat wandering the countryside, or in the back alleys of towns. He left the men before they awakened and found his present. He was soon refreshed, and another empty jar joined the small pile in the brush beside the old broken cauldron for the long-abandoned still. There was still plenty of the fine potion to keep him full and happy for at least another 2 or 3 weeks. He'd never tasted anything quite like the distillation in the wee jars with the wolf or hound head stamps on the stoppers. He smelled the once enticing odor of ham frying. Now he preferred his meat raw and dripping with hot blood, but ham cooking provided a special bouquet to his olfactory senses. He let the others eat, then confer with them on his plans to shift their operations to the roadway. But in the meantime, he decided that he wanted to look into Billy's wee bag. Seamus set aside the large bone he'd carved out of the ham. "Oh, maybe he'll want it to gnaw." The other men just grunted or nodded. None of them liked to talk when Padraig was near the huts. They knew how sharp his hearing was. Presently the big outlaw appeared as a shade in the doorway for just a moment, and then he was inside, hovering in the shadows, which seemed drawn to his form. His near glowing eyes and glittering sharp teeth were the only things clearly visible. Seamus noted that a silver crucifix pendant now hung from a cord around Padraig's neck.
The big man stroked the token of faith with fingers that sported black nails like a beast. This was a gift from an old friend, though he may have intended me harm with it. Silly superstitions about silver and crosses. Not sure why anyone would think such things would hold power outside a believer's mind. When he fingered the piece, he ensured that they all had a chance to observe the ring that now rested on his left ring finger. It was golden and heavy, the seal ring of a lord. Something that had perhaps been lost, and then lost again, when the wrong servant discovered it in the stable after his lord had returned from a long and wearying journey. It's nice, Sean commented. The cross is silver. That ring, though, probably worth a fortune. The seal alone, added Henry. Eamon intensely studied the piece of gristle on which he'd been gnawing since Padraig entered the shanty. He didn't like to look at his new master's eyes. They were black and soulless and gleamed in malice. He always felt like he was the ham bone and Padraig the biggest hound in the pack when the man, maybe, the demon, regarded him. But still, he'd handle the silver cross with no obvious discomfort. Unless he was a very powerful demon or witch man, he would have been burned or tortured by it in some way. Maybe he's the devil himself, he shouted internally, and nearly broke a tooth on the heavy bone in his hands. We'll be moving soon. This place will draw notice if it hasn't already. We need something closer to the main road anyway. That's where all the goodies are to be found. Padraig watched each of the men as they enthusiastically, if insincerely, agreed with him. He knew that their agreement was false, not about the idea, but about their feelings regarding him, their own fears and misgivings. He bared his fangs just to be certain that they understood the consequences should they disobey him. He didn't care that much what they wanted, but he cared that they feared him more than any consequences that might be imposed by authorities. He'd already moved the important item, the case of wee jars, to another cache. Nothing else they'd accumulated mattered in his mind. The vital drink was the only thing of real value that he owned. Stand and deliver, Padraig barked. He blocked the roadway and his pack moved in from each side to guard the prize. It was indeed a prize. A coach, a rare thing to be found on this road. The past 9 days had seen the crew take many purses and cargoes, but nothing from the truly wealthy. They'd not be retiring any time soon. And yet this one, it was a wealthy man's conveyance. This was their golden opportunity. They needed only to take on the guards. Padraig had issued his warning only as a formality based on robbers' tales he'd learned. He did not await a response. There were 2 mounted guards at either end of the coach and a man beside the driver, who looked doughty enough and who carried a wheel-lock blunderbuss, an unusual weapon and likely very expensive. Padraig leapt upon the horseman who was closest to him. He cleared the back of the horse with his bound and tore the man from his saddle as he passed. The move carried him forward, and he slammed into the other horse and rider. He registered the reports of muskets from the rear of the train as his pack eliminated the threat of the 2 rear guards. He wrapped his arm around the second trooper and pulled both guardsmen to the ground between their mounts. The horses pulled free and fled. By then, their riders each had ripped open throats, and Padraig had slaked his unnatural thirst for human blood, at least for the moment. The driver had halted the coach and produced a hanger. The stout man beside him had risen and pointed his piece at Padraig. Even as he faced off against them, smoke rose from the lock and a blast of fire and lead spat at the highwayman's chest. The impact laid him flat on his back. The driver clambered down and approached what he assumed was a corpse, while the gunner began to reload. He poked at the robber's midsection with the tip of the little sword. He felt himself pulled forward, while a sudden, crushing, wrenching pain in his sword arm crippled his cognizant thought process. Fangs sank into his throat and rent it from side to side. The bandit was worrying his throat like a terrier with a rat in its jaws, and the results were essentially the same. The gunner looked up in consternation as the big man he'd shot rose and casually flung aside the corpse of the driver. Impossible.
His mind shouted. He had to be dead. At least a few of the balls had struck him and sent him to the ground. He steadied himself and continued to reset the wheel. He froze when the driver's sword plunged into his abdomen and continued upward through his torso until it splintered his spine. The big, hairy highwayman had sprung up onto the carriage and skewered him. He felt his upper body go weak and he lost grip on the blunderbuss. He felt nothing new below the place where the blade had severed his spine. And then he rose. Well, he assumed that his soul was ascending to heaven. That was what he believed, even as his body crashed to the hard ground, and life fled to wherever it went at such a moment. Padraig set the brake and jumped back down to observe what his team had accomplished. There had been more gunfire during the episode, and he was curious as to what had happened. The occupants of the coach could wait for a moment longer. At the rear, he indeed found the 2 guards out of commission. One lay crushed under his equally dead mount. The other lay in a crumpled heap, pierced by bullet and blade. And yet his folk had not escaped unharmed. Seamus lay stretched on the roadway, his head split neatly, and a cavalry saber hilt waved above his carcass like a standard, the blade still wedged into his solid skull. Sean curled around an oozing wound in his gut. He was as good as dead, but would take some time to reach that state unless he was helped from this world. Padraig stepped up close to the young man, who whimpered and prayed. These sounds annoyed him, so he snapped the boy's neck and put him out of his misery. Eamon looked on terrified when his master so casually slaughtered his wounded friend. He was certain that Sean could have been saved. Good young men always healed in the stories. Henry stared for a moment, then shrugged and turned his attention to the coach. It seemed that at least one of the occupants favored resistance. Indeed, the Earl had chosen to defy his attackers. He was made of the stuff that had led his ancestor to become a peer. He stepped from the coach and struck a dignified pose, rapier poised to deal out death. Padraig and Henry both laughed. They guffawed so hard at the shared humour that the lordly man had no idea how to respond. Eamon stood, shaking his head in fear and revulsion at the entire turn of events. Padraig, who, with the exception of the little hanger, hadn't bothered with a sword much for the past week, plucked the heavy blade from Seamus's cloven head and struck up a pose every bit as dignified and absurd as that of the Earl. The nobleman glared at his opponent and studied him as he'd been taught to do. He looked into the eyes, and they appeared to him as burning black coals. The figure was tall and wore only a torn and filthy waistcoat over short trousers, shredded at the knee. He was covered in hair or some sort of fur garment. His face protruded oddly with some sort of deformity, and his ears were long and pointed, perhaps as a result of the same malady. "Prepare to meet your demise, blackguard," he issued his feeble challenge. "I am the Earl of—" Before he could continue, he found himself flat on his back, the wind knocked from his lungs and a tremendous weight pressed upon his chest and body. The gaping slavering maw of the bandit leader loomed large in his vision. "Oh, I know very well who you are, my lord. You don't know me. Despite almost 2 years of service I provided to you and your family, 2 miserable years that led me to this desperate profession." The man coughed and wheezed and recovered his breathing, as he stared in confusion at this disreputable reprobate that had attacked him so dishonorably and without proper warning. "I would recall a servant so deformed as yourself. I would never have allowed such as you in my household in the first place." He stopped speaking as the shaggy giant stepped back and hauled him bodily to his feet, and then into the air. His feet dangled in a most undignified manner. He tried to keep them so still that they didn't sway improperly. "Anyone else inside?" the bandit called over his shoulder. Henry had urged Eamon to action, and they'd sidled up to the door of the coach on the opposite side. Henry called out in return. "No, but some interesting containers and appointments." Padraig leered at his erstwhile master. He actually admired the man's bravery in the face of certain death. Perhaps he was simply too stupid to be scared, but Padraig sensed that it was dignity that the man desired to maintain. So instead of shredding his body, he rent the man's garments from him. He left him naked and bruised on the side of the road. He and his men stripped the coach and rounded up the 3 surviving horses of the troopers. None of the beasts would come near while Padraig was close, so he left them in the care of his half-diminished pack. They left the other bodies stripped of valuables and dead where they lay. The draft horses they recruited as pack animals. There was enough treasure to set up the 3 villains for a long time. When they reached their new lair, an abandoned mill near a deserted hamlet that had gone back to the wild, Padraig examined his companions as they began to divide the loot. He raised his hand with its long black animal nails. "Stop, Henry. We need to set aside a portion for me. The 2 of you keep what you have. Move on to Belfast or Dublin, and then take ship to foreign lands. Use only coins and keep the other items out of sight until you arrive where you wish to go. Our friends have perished, and you can take their holdings as well. They're secreted near this mill house. If you don't know where, I'll point them out to you. You've been boon companions, but I prefer my own company, as you each know. I believe that it is time to shift to another road and other victims, so it's time to part ways. Well, this little lord has plenty to take, but attacking the likes of them brings unwanted attention." Henry greedily began to shift the items into 2 piles that were mostly equal. It wasn't like Eamon would argue. He was timid. He paused to look up gratefully at his master, but the large being had gone already. At that point, Henry stopped dividing the pile and left the lion's share for himself. He had let Eamon have the little pile in front of him and whatever he'd already collected from earlier heists. Eamon glowered in the way that the put-upon often did when they felt their betters were not watching. Henry caught him. "What? You don't think this division is fair? You're always moping and fearful. The last to act when things get dicey. Take your hideaway coin and get moving. I'll keep the mill for tonight, then it's yours to do with as you like." Eamon pouted, but let the larger, more fit man cow him into submission. He scooped up the small pile that Henry had already set aside for him and slunk from the crumbling structure to find another shelter for the night ahead. Henry, meanwhile, rounded up all the remaining fortunes of the little band of outlaws. It was more wealth than he'd ever seen, yet had he known, it would not allow him a life of luxury and ease. At least, not a long one. Satisfied, he piled on the last of the firewood. It was cool this evening, and he set up a roaring blaze. There had been food in the coach, rich food, unlike the fare he would typically enjoy. It was a rare old time for him. He slept well and dreamed of avaricious fantasies. Eamon slept in a cold camp, his back curled against the last remaining, if crumbling, wall of the little village. He hugged his pouch to his chest and shivered until exhaustion at last sent him into slumber. Beside him lay a fine pistol he'd filched from the coach and the gold-hilted rapier of the Earl. The finest of the 3 riding horses and one of the draft horses whickered softly in their hobbles and munched on grass under the stars. Eamon didn't know much, but he was an excellent judge of horseflesh. Padraig, in the meantime, downed one of his last drafts. He had only one left. Each one had left him more beastly and mean in build, yet they'd also gifted him with unimaginable strength. His mind was still his own, most of the time. He tore the ruined waistcoat from his frame and tossed it into the bushes. He had a visit to conclude and an old comrade to set straight. It would be a long night, and it was already nearing evening when he set out. He wondered if he'd pass the Earl along the way. The peer of the realm had managed to clothe himself after a fashion before he set out on his journey. The clothing of the dead guards and driver had not been nice enough for the reavers to pinch, and it had been mostly soiled in the death throes of the men. He now had the overlarge trousers of the coach guard pulled up around his waist and secured with a belt from one of the other men. He removed a torn and bloodied coat from another,
and pulled some material from the lined walls of the transport to make a ragged cloak. He recovered a small blade from his culinary ware that the highwaymen had dropped in their rush to load the horses and be on their way, and was able to hack away at the cloth he required. Finally, he removed enough strips of wool from the remaining garments that he was able to wrap his feet. He then set out, not for town and not for his estate, but for the fort he knew to be near the next settlement. He was famished and ached from his wounds, but determined to set things right along this road, and to recover what he could of his belongings and his dignity. Billy paced the yard near the back wall of the Earl's manor. It was day 9, and he knew that there was no way he'd be able to obtain the sum Padraig had demanded. He had a little more than half, yet he feared that the man would not be satisfied. He wasn't sure that Padraig would honor the agreement anyway. He'd always been contrary in his actions. He knew that he couldn't fight the big man on his own or even with a stick. He feared that Padraig had become something strange and worse than anything he'd ever known. He hoped that the silver crucifix, which had belonged to his great-grandmother, would singe the flesh and eyes from the monster, but he had to be sure. He would have had more money, but he'd invested some in a project. He'd paid the smith to insert a silver penny into the blade of a large dirk he'd obtained from within the Earl's armory. It was a wedge-shaped blade, very sharp from years of stropping and sharpening, and was worn down from a wider, old-fashioned dagger. The smith had suspected the origin of the blade, and had gouged him on the price because of the risk to himself. But this was about survival. He couldn't be stingy when it came to preserving his own life. It wasn't all that late, but already after dark. There were still lights in the place around the manor and quarters to display that most of the inhabitants were still awake. He caught sight of Molly as she slinked her way toward the constable's quarters. They'd likely marry soon. The steward seemed to approve. He sat and gathered wool and worried, and finally he dozed. He was awakened by a grunting chortle from a throat that was no longer able to make the sounds the way an ordinary human would. He startled awake and rose. Gruff, barely decipherable words rumbled from a deep chest concealed somewhere in the shadows. "Ah, you've lost some girth, Billy, and your cheeks have gone from round to hollow, like your eyes. Haven't you been eating well, Bucko?" Billy understood who owned that alien voice, despite the metamorphosis in it. I thought you said 10 days. Today was only 9. I have almost all of it," he lied. There was a raspy chuckle. "Oh, but Billy, it is day 10. The midnight chime sounded a while ago. I didn't say what hour I intended to collect my sum. And after last time, I no longer trust you. You intended to attack me, to intentionally beat me out of what you owe me." I was only afraid last time. After all, you know what treasure I held." Billy prevaricated, in hopes of a miracle taking form. The ominous laughter sounded from directly behind him. A paw extended into his view from over his shoulder, and on it gleamed the Lord's ring. In the palm rested the silver crucifix. Take the cross. It's the one thing on which you told the truth." Billy, quaking in terror, did as he was bid. "And as for the ring," the voice rasped once more, "I have determined to keep it in repayment for the dignity of which I was robbed so many times. I completed the taxation of my former master on the highway earlier today. Now to—" It was the menace's turn to pause. "When the breeze shifted, I smelled sweet Molly. Is she in the yard?" A thrill ran through Billy as he realized a chance to shift the wicked intentions towards another target. She passed by some time ago on the way to the constable's quarters." He felt a hot, wet trickle run down his leg when the voice descended into a bestial growl, loud enough to set the hounds baying from over in their kennel and the horses in the stable neighing and shuffling in fear. Perhaps he'd misjudged the potential for ire in the savage breast of his tormentor. He dug into his waistcoat, now slick with sweat, despite the cool evening. He would get only one chance at this, and he had to take a risk.
I think old Fleming has already approved their marriage and will propose it to his lordship."
The growl indeed grew in volume and ferocity and rose to a roar of rage. Every beast on the premises was alerted, and based on the shouts and calls, many of the humans starved. Even as the last strains of the noise issued from the creature, Billy turned and stabbed as hard as he could with the blade. It plunged satisfyingly between the large ribs and into the vitals of this unholy monstrosity. The howl of agony and fury that slammed into his face caused Billy's eardrums to burst and all perception of sound to cease. He felt huge hands seize each side of his head, and then a painful tug and ripping sensation in his neck. His final few synapses formed to display the horror of the huge wolf-like man as it drank the fountain of blood from his body. Funny, I guess. He ripped off my head, the bloody bandit. And Billy was no more. Padraig was hurt badly, despite his exceptional vitality. The gush of blood from Billy's ruined neck had helped, but he could feel himself losing almost as much from the wound as he'd replaced from draining Billy's body. He pulled out the blade in his chest and flung it aside, then bound through the gate and into the night. The sounds of a thoroughly roused manor house followed him. They would not pursue him in the dark, and they would be terrorized and confused by Billy's cadaver. He had more than sufficient time to make his escape. He knew from being hunted in recent weeks that hounds would not track his scent. He had only to make it to his cache of potion, and he knew he'd be healed. Eamon wrapped himself more tightly as the false dawn lit the other side of the dilapidated wall. Clouds threatened rain in the next few hours, and he didn't wish to tromp about in the mud. He curled up more tightly and resisted the need to awaken and construct or seek shelter. He couldn't find comfort, though. Something had dug into his side during the night, likely a fallen piece of wattle or stone. He reached inside his blanket to rub at the sore spot and felt something that was oddly shaped for a product of nature. Likely some leftover trash from when people called this lonesome spot home. He kept digging at the object until he pulled it out, then forced his eyes open to view his tormentor. It was a small jar, plain except for an animal head on the seal. He awakened further and raised himself on one elbow. The jar felt full. Probably just wastewater from the rains, he grumbled. The seal looked to be intact, so he tore at it. As soon as the substance contacted the air, he smelled the wonderful fragrance. It was fresh, after all the years that must have passed. He took a sip. He had never consumed anything with such a marvelous flavor. He'd soon downed the beverage and was fully awake. Henry awakened a while after Eamon had, only to the baying of hounds and the raised voices of humans that in turns excoriated and then encouraged the loyal beasts. Other men raised voices to quiet the hunters. One voice barked orders like a soldier. Henry scrambled from his blankets and quickly doused the embers of the fire that had burned long and brightly through the night. Steam and smoke belched forth and rose through the ruined roof of the structure in which he'd sheltered. If the troops hadn't spotted his smoke before, they certainly would now. He picked up his musket and began to load. He'd neglected to clean and reload last evening, since he'd been too excited by his prospects for a bright future of luxury. He'd never considered loading the silver-trimmed blunderbuss. By the time he'd loaded the piece and picked up his saber, the infantry had surrounded his little fortress. A voice called, the authoritative one. "Surrender in the name of the king." Henry set his eye to one of the cracks in the wall and peered out to gauge his circumstances. He was indeed surrounded. At best, he could hope to hang for his crimes. He might, however, gain clemency if he gave away the suspected whereabouts of the real bandit leader, Padraig. He could even claim that he'd been forced to help the big unshorn lunatic by means of witchcraft. "You have a count of 5 to show yourself. Hands raised."
the troop leader called. And before the count even began, Henry stepped out into the morning light, hands empty and raised. Padraig raced back to the little settlement that had been devoured by the wild some years past. His wound had finally stopped leaking. The vitality was still within him. However, he wanted to heal completely and to see what changes the final draft might engender. It was full daylight and edging toward noon. He didn't care for daytime, but today was a nice gloomy one, with lowering clouds and a soft rain that had begun not long after dawn. There was no drama to the weather, only persistence. He circled around the old mill. He didn't want to bother with his former band. He only wanted to reach his potion and find relief. He approached the wall with no fear of encountering another soul. He'd left his last wee jar near the last standing wall of the village. Despite the rain, he caught some strange odors, the heavy smell of horses, and then Eamon. The effluvia emanated from all too near his hidey hole. He bounded ahead, and his darkest fears were realized. The little jar, opened and emptied, lay next to the wall. Well, he was a top-tier predator and soon located the trail that led from the settlement and deeper into the hills above. Even after the rain, it was easy to follow horses, and Eamon's scent seemed somehow more vital. Despite his pain and unaccustomed weariness, he set out in pursuit of the thief, the ragged little coward who'd always slunk along at the rear of the pack during their forays. The Earl was satisfied that Henry had given all the information he possessed about the whereabouts of his companions. I believe we should hang him in town as an example for any who are tempted towards criminal enterprises. Henry would have balked and squawked, but he was barely conscious after the interrogation. He would indeed set an inspirational example for his fellows in the little town. A few decided that they had nothing to lose and set forth roving. Others decided that they had a community spirit and would comply with the law such as it was, and the 4 lost recruits were soon replaced by new, more eager ones. Many found new wonder in their occupations and applied themselves just a little bit more diligently. The wages of sin and high crimes did not appeal to the reticent majority. Eamon heard the thumps behind him and halted. He didn't get through the turn he'd started, since a large form slammed into him and knocked him several feet back. He drew the fancy rapier and struck a pose, much as had the rapier's previous owner. It was Padraig, looking wilder and more beastly than ever. He'd finally shed even his breeches and stood hunched and breathing heavily. Eamon noted the blood had begun to trickle from an aggravated recent wound. He intended to add to that opening and end the threat of the monster of the hills. "Come on, Padraig. I no longer fear you. I will skewer your—" And Eamon felt his arm gripped within powerful claws and his body flung to the ground. The rapier spun away and sparkled when a ray from the newly emerged sun struck it. A foot crushed into his side, the one into which the wee jar had dug. Then a deep sore pain, followed by a sharp tugging which plagued his shoulder for a moment. He felt a rush from his heart as the blood fountained and then was drawn from where his sword arm had been. He heard noxious gulping and slurping sounds as Padraig gorged himself on Eamon's blood, potion, tonic and all. He heard the panicked neighs of his horses and the thunder of their hooves on the turf as they ran away in search of a sturdier master. And then he heard nothing more in this life. Padraig ran the hills in glee under the newly risen full moon. He didn't truly think of himself as Padraig anymore. Names did not concern him. He ran about on all fours and felt freer than he ever had, clumsily stumping along on 2, using only half his resources for running. He stopped for a moment and howled. He knew that the sound would strike fear into anyone caught out after nightfall. Though he stalked travellers along the various trails and treks of the wilds, he no longer sought golden treasures.
He now preferred the crimson fountain that sprang from the arteries of the soon-to-be dead. Another phenomenal story there from Michael G. Lockhart, also known as Bearlair64. He's been a good friend to this channel for many a story now, and that one was as good as anything he's ever done. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. Many thanks to him, and thanks to you all for once again taking the time to listen. Well, what did you think of that one? Thoughts, feelings, anything else you want to say in the comment section below the vid, and as usual, I'll do my best to join in the chat. Well, that's it for Monday. Back again here on Wednesday probably, and hope you're all going to join me once again. So till next time, sweet dreams and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.